Shalom, I'm Dr. Dinah Dye with Foundations in Torah. Welcome back to our study on the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a great theologian of the Second World War, pre-Second World War period, who spoke out against the Nazi regime, which only found him in prison, and he was later hung before the Allies were able to liberate Germany. But he is the voice of a generation and one whom I have a tremendous amount of admiration and respect for. Just his life is a wonderful projection to us at this time of what one man can do in the face of tyranny. And so hopefully all this, I've been kind of laying the groundwork of Bonhoeffer's life. We're going to get to talking about some of the things he said, some of the things that he discovered in his own prayer time, and as he wrestled with the whole concept of the relationship between the church and the state. This has been an area that has caused a lot of consternation over generations. What is our role? How do we deal with ourselves as the church, the congregation, in the face of tyranny, in the face of a government that is as tyrannical as the Nazis were? What do we do? As I mentioned probably in the first session, many of us struggle with where's the line in the sand? Where do I finally get to that line and say, enough, I'm not going any farther, I'm standing up against it? And it's probably different for all of us, but I think in the end we all have to find that place. And things are going to get a lot more difficult because it is the nature of leaders. They either are servant leaders or they are slave leaders. There's no middle ground here, and so we are always doing battle in this area, and it is the nature of man to kind of descend into that place in which he lords it over others, where he enslaves others, where he exalts himself over others, or he remains humble and submissive to God, esteems others better than himself, and basically is a servant to others. As I said, there's no middle ground between the two, and things end up going in either direction. And really every empire since the very beginning, going all the way back to Nimrod, we've always ended up in the same place. Interestingly enough, Nimrod's name in its very root means the continuing seed of rebellion. And so that's what we find in every empire as it rises up. It may start out benevolent and with the best of intentions, but it always ends up in the same place. You think of Israel's time in Egypt. When they first went down there, things were great between Israel and the Pharaoh. All was well, but then in time, one rose up who did not understand, did not recognize, did not care about the children of Israel, only wanted to basically have them removed from his midst, unless when it was no longer apparent that he could get out of them, when he needed to build his empire. So it is the nature of tyrants to enslave. The first place they generally enslave is in the area of sort of your personal financial realities, if you will. We see this with Nimrod as he took the bricks, and all the bricks were exactly the same, and he built his tower. And if the bricks kind of represent people, we see the nature of the first regime making everyone alike, everyone having exactly the same. This is the cycle over and over again. We can call it today Nazism, socialism, Marxism, whatever you want to call it, but it's the same ism, and it all goes back really to the very first empire, and that is of Nimrod. And so here we are in World War II, the same thing happening. Now our first picture here was we have Hitler basically joining forces with the Lutheran Church. Muller is the leader of the Lutheran Church at that time, and they are in league together. The Lutheran Church is basically the state-run church. It's sanctioned by the state, and Hitler knew his strategy was to take the church prisoner first, which is exactly what he did. So this is something we need to be on the lookout for as well. And then once he took control of the church, then all the other political realities followed after that. So he removed the spiritual center, the spiritual center of influence and power, I guess, in the midst of the German people. And once it was gone, the church became the prisoner of the state and basically a prisoner of the culture. And this is the strategy of every tyrant. And so we can expect to see the same thing happening. The goal is to remove the influence of the church in the culture. And I think we're all seeing that today. Now, much of the culture today, much of the church today has lost its influence in culture. We have kind of a slide here of the sort of remains of Berlin at the end of World War II with a sort of saint there on the top of that pedestal, and that's kind of where we are. And now the one way in our current time that the church has lost its power and influence is because it's been controlled by something we would call political correctness, and that's been around forever as well. And the church has dutifully fallen in line to political correctness. Now let me just say, not everyone and not every church and not every organization, not every ministry, not every denomination. And I'm just sort of looking at the church as an institution at large, and certainly kudos to the ones that have stood up for the unborn and stood out against all kinds of different sin and have rescued people out of it and have ministered to people around the world and taken care of widows and orphans and the fatherless, etc. But as an institution in American life today, just as the Lutheran Church in German life at the time, it's lost its sphere of influence, and that is by design, and that is exactly what the enemy will do. So the government then at the time was controlling the church, just as we have been controlled. And the culture really starts to bear down on the church, and the church has to make a decision of which direction it's going to go. So for example, there's nothing in the scriptures that sanction the murder of babies, of innocent babies, in the womb or out. And so when the government sanctions this and the church dutifully falls in line, the church has got to look at itself and it's got to evaluate. Now, you may not be connected to a particular organization, but you certainly have an obligation to stand against this, no matter where you find yourself. We have already murdered 50 million plus babies. God will not be mocked, and He will certainly deal with this. And we need to hold ourselves to account in our communities and going out from there. We have failed as a spiritual people, if you will, to be salt and light in this generation. And so we have joined forces with the culture in many ways. We have not wanted to set ourselves apart from the culture. We want to be liked, we want to be loved, we want people to join our communities. Many churches have kind of, not all, but some, let me say some, have really sold out in many areas because they want to keep people coming in, they don't want to offend anybody. You got to figure out the point where it doesn't matter who you offend. You've got to stand for God, and you've got to stand for His righteousness and what He's called us to. I think we see in Germany, sort of after the Weimar Republic, what's happening there culturally, it's a sewer heap in Germany. You've got all those cabaret clubs and all the stuff that's going on there. Things are really out of control. And so one of the areas, again, that's similar that we saw in pre-World War II Germany is sort of the descending of the culture into this sort of moral abyss. And I would be hard to not say that that's what we're experiencing in our culture. So the more the church withdraws from being a vanguard in the culture, the more the culture ends up in the sewer. Now, the key in all this, that what Bonhoeffer was saying, is that we must prepare ourselves spiritually for what's ahead. I have a photo here of Bonhoeffer. It's important. He could not stress enough how important it was to take a stand, and lots of times he was alone in taking that stand. Now, certainly he worked within the confines of his family and the confessing church, but many times he stood out on his own. He understood the times, and he understood evil. And that is another significant thing that's happened. It happened really with the German church, the Lutheran church at the time. People did not even recognize evil staring it in the face, staring them in the face. And so I think the same thing is happening now. A lot of people just cannot distinguish between good and evil, between right and wrong, of course, because our foundations have been weakened and we've removed our the foundations of our, if you will, Judeo-Christian. Some people don't like to use that term, but really we did have a strong foundation at one time in our country of the Judeo-Christian ethic, and it's certainly gone. One of the things he did in order to enable himself to be able to do this is that he maintained a strict daily discipline of Scripture reading, Scripture meditation, and prayer. And remember, I've said his idea of study was to return to the Tanakh. It was very important, and his prayer life was filled with the study and the practice of the Psalms. That was very important. He found that the Psalms were a revelation and a great comfort to him, and I think that should be true for us. And the Psalms were considered, the book of Psalms was considered to be the second hymn book of the hymn book, of the Second Temple period. It was a very important part in the sort of Levitical priesthood, and the ceremonies in the temple were all kind of surrounded the Psalms themselves. And in fact, as it progressed into the Siddur, the set order of prayer, many of those Psalms ended up in the daily prayer book. So I wouldn't say that Bonhoeffer was following a Siddur, but he certainly understood the importance and the significance of the book of Psalms. He often said he was not naturally strong and courageous, and I think many of us would probably agree with that statement. I certainly don't feel that way. However, the key to his success, if you will, was self-discipline, and deliberately, even when he didn't feel like it, turning to God. Even when he maybe didn't feel like praying, he prayed. He disciplined himself strictly, virtually every single day. And I think that the art of self-discipline is one that's lost today. And we sort of, because we go on emotion and feeling, we tend not to just persevere in a discipline. It's a hard word, and it's a hard concept, and it's an even harder reality. But it is a message from Bonhoeffer and a key to your faith. So let me just read a quote from him. He said, "We cannot reach God with our own prayers, but by praying His prayers, we effectively piggyback on them all the way to heaven. We must not confuse what we do naturally, wishing and hoping and sighing and lamenting and rejoicing. We cannot confuse all those things with prayer." And that is easy to do. How often do we sort of wish and hope, well, I hope God will do this, and I wish He would do that, but we don't sort of discipline ourselves and get on our knees and on our face, using the Psalms as our hymn book in order to reach the heart of God. We really, this is an area I think we all really need to grow in. Some of us may have arrived, but I know that I want to keep pressing in this particular area. There's much to learn and much to grow. I think we have an advantage then, sort of in the Hebrew roots movement itself, for those who would recognize the value of the set order of prayer that God has given to His people since the beginning, because those prayers are really just the substitute for the offering service. And so this offering service that was set up from the very beginning, going back to Adam and Hava, the words of our lips became that replacement. So I think we have a bit of an advantage over Bonhoeffer in that particular area. He further goes on to say that prayer is unnatural to us and must be initiated by God outside us. That's kind of sobering, and we need to let God outside us help initiate it so that we enter in. He said, praying the Psalms, we pray along with Yeshua's prayers. Isn't that interesting that he recognized that? Certainly, the Psalms were what Yeshua obviously knew them, but as he participated in the various ceremonies in the temple, those Psalms that were associated with those ceremonies would have certainly been an important part, and he would have participated in that. The idea that prayer doesn't naturally come from within us. We have to just push against our flesh to enter in on a daily basis. And he went on to say this concept of prayer, certainly praying along with the Psalms, recognizing how unnatural it was and that it needed to be initiated by God. He said this idea would have been very Jewish to the Nazis. So certainly one of the areas that the Nazis would have liked to eliminate was sort of the prayer life of Christians at the time. And it is in the prayer time in which God speaks to you, and if you will listen and you hear, certainly if the institution of the German church, the Lutheran church at the time, what if they had been devoted to God in this way in prayer, they would have heard from him that they were joining themselves with the regime to destroy the apple of his eye. It's really only in prayer that you're going to hear how you would walk and how you would deal with such as what Bonhoeffer was dealing with. That's one of the reasons I appreciate him so much, because he had such a strong prayer life. It was attached to the Tanakh and to the Psalms, and so that the things that he saw and understood and the words he wrote are very important to us because of how they came about. He didn't just sort of pen things because he was sitting at his desk one day and they just kind of came to him. He labored in prayer to hear these things, to be able to communicate them. Let's go to another quote here. He says, "When the Psalter is abandoned, an incomparable treasure is lost to the church. With its recovery will come unexpected power." I find that to be absolutely profound. The depth of his relationship to the Psalms. Again, the Psalms were the hymn book of the temple period, the Second Temple period. So you think of Psalms like Psalm 145 to 150, which were what we call the Ashrei, which were actually really the Beatitudes. Psalm 113 to 118 were the Halim that were sung by the priesthood at the times of the various festivals when all the pilgrims came up to Jerusalem and the Levitical choir stood on the steps and they sung these psalms. Psalm 136, the great Hallel, part of the Passover Seder service. The songs of ascent, the songs of going up to Jerusalem, Psalms 120 to 134. All of these very much part of temple worship and something that it would appear Bonhoeffer well understood. And he understood that so much was lost by not capturing what the Psalms could communicate. Lost to the church, and he even identified it with losing power. So that's how significant that was for him. Again, the Psalms are the prayer book of the Bible. He actually wrote a book on the Psalms from the Old Testament. Basically, he said, in search of scholarly truth. And I have done a lot of work in the prayer service, and so I was profoundly moved by this to see that this man really understood that. It was, in fact, Saja Gaon who declared that the Psalms was, in fact, the book of Psalms, the 5 books of Psalms, if you will, was the hymn book of the Second Temple period. In fact, the correlation between the 5 books of the Torah and the 5 books of the Psalms, there's a connection there. And so that the Torah and the Psalms really go hand in hand in terms of entering into the presence of God. Now, returning back to Bonhoeffer, he was very passionate in understanding the importance of the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, and its connection to Christianity. Now, that was revolutionary for the time. I can't even imagine under the German Lutheran Church them even embracing the Tanakh. I mean, we see that today in our time, in our culture here in the United States, that Many churches, some churches, don't even think there's any connection really to the Tanakh and to the Old Testament. So that was pretty revolutionary pre-World War II. He understood and he declared verbally that Christianity was unavoidably Jewish. Now that was profound for the time, for sure. He understood that Yeshua gave himself to the Psalms and to the Tanakh. And as I just mentioned, the Psalms in terms of the worship service in the temple of the time. He recognized that most of the references to the Tanakh, many of them were in the New Testament, and many of them were the Psalms. In fact, I would think probably about 90% of the references in the Gospels and the Epistles are to the Psalms. He understood that the Tanakh was not superseded by the New Testament, but that they were inextricably linked together. So these are things that he understood at that time which were revolutionary for the time, really rather amazing and really important in what he was able to uncover. We have kind of a little picture here of a siddur and a talit, and just to go along with this concept that he recognized that Yeshua himself was Jewish. Now, I know that may seem silly to us in our audience, but at his time, people just didn't consider that. And many in the mainline Lutheran Church did not recognize that Yeshua himself was Jewish. He declared and he understood and he spoke to the fact that the Jews were in fact God's people, that Messiah came from them and he came from them first, and that God had never abandoned the Jewish people. His goal, the heart of God, he longed to reach out to them because he determined that God himself, that they were the apple of his eye. Bonhoeffer further said that the one who would preserve his word, the Jews were the ones who preserved his word and his services. And this is true when you go back through all the history of time. The one thing that the Jewish people have always maintained and protected and guarded with everything they had is the Torah and the services. And this is really key, especially for those of us in exile. They, in every generation, have preserved those things. And so these are the things that Bonhoeffer understood instinctively as he prayed and entered in. We have just a photo here of the slaughtering of an animal. And he said that this idea of the teaching of sin and grace was very much a Jewish attitude that was in the New Testament, but that this concept of how sin and grace were dealt with was this concept of sin and the death of the animal and repentance and all these things was just way too negative for the Germans at the time. So in this sort of secular humanist culture and as the church, the German Lutheran Church, very much attached to the state, it was not walking in its destiny. And so everything was kind of like the be happy thing, which I know many of you will recognize happening in our churches today. But Bonhoeffer was a firm believer that you must hear what God has to say. And you didn't want to enter into prayer sort of having God commend your own personal views. You didn't want to hope that God heard your prayers. You wanted to leave the prayer closet knowing that God had heard your prayers and that it wasn't your view he was putting his stamp of approval on, but that you were understanding his view and you were walking out of that prayer closet seeing it from his way. Again, imagine had there been those in the church, the state-run church at the time, if they could have seen things in that particular light. Let me just read this quote here. To dare to sing to God when his chosen people were being beaten and murdered. And he went on, one must speak against their suffering. And I think that, again, is profound in how much he attached himself to that. Really, the Lutheran Church was very much like the church of today. And when I say church, I am not I'm not discounting any entity. Bonhoeffer was functioning in the context of a church, and we have a church community in the United States. It takes on many different forms, but I'm talking about the believing community altogether, whether it's a church, whether it's a Messianic movement, whatever it is, we are all accountable in the same way. We believe Yeshua is the Messiah, and we are called to a deeper walk than than how we are walking. So I'm going to sort of enter into our next topic that I'll be talking about next week, and that is the topic of leadership, because that's really, I think, one of the keys in all this. So anytime you have a leadership vacuum, it's going to be filled somehow. And so we come out of World War I, Germany has been decimated, things are very difficult. There is the depression financially, things are bad, there's inflation's through the roof. It's a morally, spiritually bankrupt time. So there's a big hole in the German people and in that context. And so into that hole, into that vacuum, one rose up, and it was all ready for him, for Hitler to come into. And so he just took advantage of a people who were experiencing a lot of turmoil, having just had a crisis. So we'll pick it up next time. We'll see you then. Shalom.